architecture and about architectural history, for me it's very difficult to think of too many people who have made a greater contribution to the field of modernity and modernism than Jean-Louis has done. Apart from being an important historian and theorist of architecture, he has really been one of the people who has been very actively engaged in the discipline, organizing, curating very important exhibitions that they themselves have really then led to new discoveries in the field. Recently, for example, I'm sure you all know the 1930s project that he has been organizing in Paris, and also the exhibition that was at the CCA, I think about a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, on this, related to the topic of tonight's lecture on the aspect of Amerikanismus. Jean-Louis is a professor of town planning history at the Institut Français d'Urbanisme at the University of Paris 8, and is also the Sheldon H. Solow Professor for the History of Architecture at NYU. Among his many publications are Scenes of the World to Come, European Architecture and the American Challenge, 1893-1960, and Le Corbusier and the Mystique of the USSR, Theories and Projects for Moscow, 1928-1936. Would you please join me in welcoming Jean-Louis Cohen?
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for skipping the wonderful late afternoon. I really feel embarrassed to have drawn you indoors with this magnificent sun. I've drawn you indoors to discuss the work of Richard Neutra, a Vienna-born architect, in the great outdoors of California, and more globally, Neutra's contribution to the discourse of Americanism. We see here as two openers for this lecture, Richard Neutra's on the left, Richard Neutra's first drawing when he comes to America in 1923, Manhattan seen through the Brooklyn Bridge. He's then 31 and comes from Berlin, from Austria, from Vienna through Berlin. We see him on the right looking over the shoulder of his second American father, Frank Lloyd Wright, with whom he worked in the years 1924 to the beginning of 1925. We'll see later who are Neutra's other American fathers, number 1 and number 3. But first of all, I wanted to establish for a moment a couple of notions about the problem of Americanism, to which I have devoted many articles and 2 books. For me, in the discussion of the architecture of the 20th century, the articulation of localism and internationalism has always, as in general, been flowed by the overestimation of international groups like the SIAMs, for instance, but patterns of cultures which have been active in many cultural areas of this planet have been underscored, and in particular the discourse of Americanism. Americanism is not Americanization. I will return to this later. It is not what is happening since World War II in Europe, with the transformation of the territory on the base of American models. Americanism is a set of representations that are active in architecture, in European architecture first of all, and then and now in other contexts, in Latin America, in Asian architecture as well. Americanism is a set of representations that which is constructed in order to present America as the scene of the world to come, to paraphrase travel account published by Georges Duhamel in 1930. Scenes of the world to come, America represents for European architects at the turn of the century, in the 30s and also in the 50s, the image of what will happen to European architecture and to European cities. Amerikanism works, as we'll see in this very brief introduction, Amerikanism works vertically in the development of the skyscrapers and the vertical city, but also into the depth of the urban ground. Amerikanism works also horizontally in the development of the infinite territory of the Midwest and of the Great West, as we'll see with Neutra. Amerikanism also, and this is extremely important, works inside the factory with the transformation of industrial labor that takes place in the early years of this century. So before discovering the function of Neutra as an agent of and almost, I would say, as a victim before becoming a promoter of Amerikanism, I wanted to make a couple of points clear if I push the right button. Sorry. Okay. I have a problem here. This one, yes, okay. Oh, yes, I want to go for, back. Back. Yes, but oh yes, I had missed the. Okay, I'm fine. Good. Excellent. So here we see the opening stage of Amerikanism. The opening. If I'm using the term scene or stage rather without innocence. America is extremely is an architectural world which becomes which is very visual, which is transmitted to Europe through a series of means, including, of course, the printed magazines that led at the turn of the century with the new technology of photo reproduction to an extremely rapid circulation of ideas. We have the illusion that the internet today spreads out images in seconds. But in fact, at the turn of the century, the time for the diffusion of images, and in particular of American images, was extremely short also. In a couple of weeks, images would travel to the depth of Russia or to the depth of Brazil. And in a way, Amerikanism was also at that time an almost instant culture. So the opening stage is extremely clear. It is the World's Columbian Exhibition of 1893 in Chicago on the left. The White City, as it was called, because of the Beaux-Arts architecture designed by Daniel Burnham. But to thousands and thousands of engineers, civil engineers and architects who did the trip to Chicago, the White City was much less interesting than the Black City, than the real city that you can see on the right, that is a city made out of factories, of slaughterhouses. Paul Bourget wrote French novelist Bourget wrote a travel account describing Chicago as Porkopolis, the city of pork with the slaughterhouses. The Black City also of office buildings, of the early skyscrapers which were observed by many architects. So and many novelists and many journalists. An early interest for the American high-rise construction had already started in the years before the exhibition. On the left, you see a project made at the École des Beaux-Arts in 1892 for a gratte-ciel américain, a commercial beehive. No one among the Beaux-Arts students had ever been to America, but nonetheless, they tried to imagine what a vertical building Chicago-like would be. There is even on this watercolor rendering, which is twice that size in natural scale, a small Indian with feathers in order to Americanize this the late Haussmannian building. On the right, you can see the dream of many current architects taking shape in the early Americanist discourse. The dream of a communicative building. Jean Nouvel is still today fantasizing about buildings carrying signs, carrying lights, light messages, carrying gigantic screens, communicating with the universe. This is another Beaux-Arts project of 1907, also done as an answer to the Prix Américain, as an answer to the American challenge inside the school. Here we see another dimension of Americanism in the years before 1914. Americanism not simply is certainly the dense and the vertical city, it's also a city which is based on functional zoning, a notion designed in Germany, but which had traveled and developed in America. And we see here two aspects of the new American cities that are of foremost interest for European town planners, landscape architects, and architects. That is the park system, the development of a comprehensive system of parks on the left in Chicago, as seen by French landscape architect Forestier. On the right, the same situation in Chicago seen by the German town planner and critic Werner Hegemann. So we have a convergent discourse in many European countries on this notion that the American city is shaping the future metropolis in front of European eyes. Another extremely important discourse, of course, has to be is connected with the reconstruction, what I would call the reconstruction of urban ground, of urban soil. You can see on the left an extremely influential drawing by the architect Harvey Wiley Corbett, published in 1913 in the Scientific American, an idea of New York in the future with a superimposed network of underground streets, of underground trains, and bridges up in the air. This image will be reprinted. I return to a point I was making before. Will be reprinted in days, if not weeks, in France, in Italy, where it will be one of the important messages that Antonio Sant'Elia, I have a pointer somewhere, Antonio Sant'Elia, as you can see on the, I don't know, yes, okay, problems with mechanics today. Here you see Antonio Sant'Elia designing the central city for his Città Nuova of 1914 after models coming from America. One could even make the hypothesis that this perspective in the background is similar to Park Avenue in New York, which, as you know, is created in these years on the buried track of the railway. So what circulates between America and Europe is also a specific vision of the dense city, of a city based, as Rem Koolhaas, a late Americanist, would later suggest it, a city based on congestion, on the relationship of a vertical business city and a very thick layer of transportation. We'll see how Neutra will, in one of these projects, discuss this idea in particular. Of course, America is about skyscrapers, and European architects will work on the notion of a skyscraper in lots of different ways. Here again, two examples. One is rather well known. This is the entry by Eliel Saarinen, Finnish architect, in the Chicago Tribune competition of 1922. The number of architects participating to this competition is really an expression of the growing interest for the physical reshaping of the American city, as much as the importance of the number of architects participating to the Berlin Friedrichstrasse competition, for which Mies van der Rohe designs his first glass skyscraper. On the right, a very much more intimate sketch, A4 size, by Auguste Perret on an ideal city of towers, Ville Tour, which is a sort of condensed version of what happens on the shore of Manhattan, the connection between ocean liner and building, which becomes metaphoric in the discourse of Le Corbusier, is here literal. The ocean liner come and land on a shore which is lined with skyscrapers. We know that it is now well established and will be even more with the publication of a correspondence between Perret and Le Corbusier, that Le Corbusier's towers in the Ville Contemporaine of 22 and later in many other projects are a direct answer to a pattern designed by his elder Auguste Perret and former boss. We see here another aspect of Americanism which is extremely important. In his 1913 article published in the yearbook of the German Werkbund, Walter Gropius on the left, this calls America the motherland of industry. In German, it's the fatherland. It's the Mutterland, it's the motherland. In German, fatherland, you would say probably in English. The fatherland of industry because of the development of new structures which will be praised from now on from this early article by Gropius by most architects of the modern movement, as Rainer Benham has convincingly argued in his Concrete Atlantis, in his splendid book. Here we see Gropius's discussion and Gropius's production. The Faguswerk built in 1914 in Alfeld, which clearly derives from images of factories by Albert Kahn, which had been seen by Walter Gropius. It is here important to note that architects who will in the 1930s come to the US to bring supposedly the message of modern architecture, architects like Gropius or Mies van der Rohe, were in fact architects who had been subject in Germany, in Europe, to the pressure of Americanism when they had not taken directly part in the development of this discourse. And the same will be true in a different way for someone like Neutra. Inside the factories, inside American factories, on the left, once again, we see a sketch by Perret, and on the right, we see the propaganda leaflet by Michelin, who fights against the black beasts, les bêtes noires of lost time, wasted time and waste, and discusses the destinies of the compared destinies of Sam, the American worker who drives to the factory, and François, who walks almost barefoot to the factory in Clermont-Ferrand. So the Western European industrialists, French, British, German, and also the Russian factory managers will develop in the 1920s a fantastic propaganda effort for the reorganization of the factory after American models. But this is not what I will discuss today. I will center on the single most important discourse of the early 1920s, the discourses that take place in Germany. In Germany after 1920, when the reconstruction of the economy begins, American capital is extremely present. American capital is heavily, American loans are extremely important in the modernization of the industry, but at the same time, American models appear in the discussion on architecture and town planning. One of the major agents of Amerikanismus, as Amerikanism is known in Germany, is Werner Hegemann, the editor of the magazine Was Muts Monatshefte, who publishes in 1925-27 a book on American architecture and building art, which recycles in a much more ambitious way patterns and proposals based on American examples already featured in a book called Civic Art in 1922, a book which has been reprinted in the US and might be known to some people here. But the major episode, the most important one for me, is of course the trip of Erich Mendelssohn, the expressionist architect, to America in 1924. To give an indication of the importance of this trip, I will only say that the companion Mendelssohn had on the boat, on the Deutschland, was a filmmaker called Fritz Lang, who, after his return to America, to Germany from America, decided to film Metropolis. So in a way that Mendelssohn went to a series of experiences, to a series of impressions that were powerful to the point of leading to also major changes in the movies. We see on the left Mendelssohn in the streets of New York, on the right the cover of an extremely important book. The book is important because for the first time here an architect is not reprinting, is not publishing plates in his book, but is really using his camera as a notebook, as a visual notebook. And we see here Mendelssohn looking at the American cities, New York, Chicago, Detroit, in a completely new way, using worm's eye perspective, using contrasting shots of foreground and background, using sequences of images inspired by the movies. Really an extremely important and founding moment in a discourse which is no longer a discourse on the power of industry, but a visual discourse in which Mendelssohn submits a rather negative assessment of America. America as a country of excessive power. America as a country which is seated on its sack of gold but has no culture. So it is a very mixed discourse, celebration of the impressiveness of a big city, but at the same time an expression of fear and also an expression of contempt in respect to this what Mendelssohn considers a rather childish American culture, also childish in its use of historicist ornament on the otherwise rational skyscrapers. We see more images of the book. America is also extreme. The book is published in 1926. It is based on photos largely stolen or borrowed without permission by Mendelssohn from various people. First of all, a Danish architect called Knud Lundberg Holm, also a competitor in the Chicago Tribune and who had been invited to the US and was teaching at Ann Arbor. On the left, you can see an original photo by Lundberg Holm, which was used by Mendelssohn without credit, at least in the first edition. He even used photos by Fritz Lang without crediting him. But what you see here is a clear illustration of what of the dark side of the American city, which was, of course, beginning to be photographed by major American photographers, in New York in particular, but was fairly new as an address to the architectural audience. We see also in Mendelssohn's books extremely interesting street scenes where the messy streetscape contrasts with a rather crystalline and pristine backgrounds. It is interesting to see how this book has circulated and the effect that the book has had. For instance, on the right, this image was discussed in a certain length by the theater playwright Bertolt Brecht, who was himself a very active Americanist, if I may say so. Brecht's first play was called In the Jungle of Cities. He would later, as you know, stage the resistible rise of Adolf Hitler in Arturo Ui, according to Brecht, in Chicago. So in an imaginary Chicago. So Brecht fantasies on America will be fed by the discourse of Mendelssohn. We see here the further impact of Mendelssohn, and I will stop here and return to Neutra, who has been forgotten in the past 15 minutes or 20 minutes. The book of Mendelssohn is extremely important as a prism through which, for instance, the Russian avant-garde discovers America. The Russians don't travel to America at that time, and they hardly travel to the West, and so they see America through the eye of Mendelssohn. It's the title of an article by Lisitsky, where he celebrates, he praises Mendelssohn, the eye of the architect. On the left, we see Essay, the constructivist magazine, reprinting Mendelssohn, and on the right, Rodchenko, the constructivist artist and photographer, discussing the very notion of modern photography by opposing photos of Mendelssohn to the static photos of the conservative photographers. So in a way, Mendelssohn is a very important, Mendelssohn's book is a very important moment in European and German, but beyond Germany, in European Americanism at large. Now let's return to young Richard Neutra. We see on the left, can I have a focus on the left? Yes, thank you. We see on the left a photo by, from Mendelssohn's archive, a photo he has made in New York at the time of his trip. A photo in which he opens a book showing his famous hat factory in Luckenwalde in Germany, as if he were saying to the American audience, I am also capable of doing factories. The chief draftsman for this project was Richard Neutra, who had left Vienna in the early 20s and in order to work with Mendelssohn. We see on the right another function that Neutra played when Mendelssohn, hidden by the smoke here, and Frank Lloyd Wright met in Taliesin in 1924. Neutra was the interpreter, or rather the misinterpreter, who said to Wright the nice things that Mendelssohn was not saying, and said to Mendelssohn the nice things that Wright was not saying. And they became friends forever. So we see here Neutra as being a third person in this encounter of Mendelssohn and Wright. Mendelssohn had commented much on Wright, and it would be a pretty long story to discuss this. Mendelssohn will criticize very, Neutra, will criticize very valiantly the book of Mendelssohn, saying Mendelssohn has formed a judgment about the country which is as negative as it is superficial. I don't think it is possible to get a correct idea about this district of human civilization without paying the price as I do, to know it by patiently working here. In fact, Neutra, and this is his first contribution to Americanism, will have a very important role in presenting as an architectural reporter the daily practice of big American firms. And this is the function that his first book on America will play in 1927. Neutra had arrived in 23. In 25, he moves to Los Angeles to work with his old friend Rudolf Schindler. We see here a famous photo of Neutra and Schindler in the house Schindler had built on Kings Road in Hollywood in 1922. We see on the right the last project Neutra and Schindler did together, the League of Nations entry of 1926. Schindler was pissed off because the project got published in Europe under the name of Neutra alone. The Neutras had always had a very keen sense of publicity and will retain it. And he brought, together with an intrigue connected with the Lovell Commission, which I will discuss later, he then quit the partnership with Neutra. It is interesting to know that already in 1920, when Neutra was beginning to envision coming to America, he wrote to his friend Schindler, I would like to know more about American architecture than just the names Richardson, Sullivan, Wright. Help me, send me something to study. I believe, as you do, that the new objectives will come from America. So Neutra was expecting much from America, and for a very good reason. He had a first American father. I mentioned the second, Frank Lloyd Wright. The first one was no one else than Adolf Loos. In many cafe conversation, in conversations in Vienna, Neutra had heard Loos lecturing or talking about America and describing his real or fantasy experiences. For Neutra, Loos was the Walt Whitman of Lower Manhattan and was telling incredible stories about America. To him, I quote Neutra in his book of memories published in 1962. To him, America was the land of unshackled minds, of people with debunked minds, let us say, of people brought close to life's realities, which are more than all cultural mannerisms and hangovers taken too seriously. Realities in a new time, naively, subconsciously kept in matter-of-fact working order. People here, Neutra writes from America, as an American in the early 60s, as he saw them, had reverted to a sound attitude which had been lost in the old country. In fact, Neutra is amazed at the analysis that Loos does of American culture. And he mentions a very interesting aspect of Loos' celebration of America. You know that Loos didn't like American architecture, was rather celebrating America's material culture. And in particular, Neutra writes, Loos was at heart interested in handicraft. And one of his ideals in this field was the well-finished Viennese cabinet work, which, even before his period, had been obliterated by gaudy Victorianism and then threatened by Art Nouveau fashions. Smiling, he would say that the most beautiful piece of cabinet work was the American oak toilet seat. It was wonderful. Today plastic is used, but in those days there were well-curved and shaped oak seats. Loos became dithyrambic about this graceful but matter-of-fact article, how it was fitted on the china fixture, how neatly it was joined, and how well it would withstand all abuse. He always gave this as an example of American cabinet work, and his eyes shone with the enthusiasm of a craftsman or a man whose life's work is to hand-shape boomerangs or tobacco pipes or well-finished, unique Cremona violins. So we see, in fact, how Neutra's Americanism develops, a reaction against the negative problematic of Mendelssohn, and also, I would say, a development of Loos' crafty attitude, of Loos's attitude geared towards material culture. In this respect, the book Neutra publishes in 1927 is extremely innovative. The book is called Wie baut Amerika, How America Builds, and is what I would call today a technical report. Neutra discusses the problems of American cities, the problem of American downtowns in particular, and introduces, this is probably the least interesting part of the book, his own project called Rush City Reformed, a project which in fact is an answer to Saint-Elia's ideas, to Le Corbusier's Ville Contemporaine, and also to Hilberseimer's Vertical City of 1924. We see here the central city of Rush City Reformed, in fact, a redesign of Chicago's downtown area. And once again, we meet the idea of the underground train station, which comes from Grand Central and the projects of the pre-14 period. We see on the right this very interesting image of the downtown, of the central area of Rush City Reformed, pretty close to Hilberseimer's Vertical City. Residents on the top, offices under the ground, and footbridges in every direction. This is also an interesting abstract design. In the exhibition I did in '95, people kept hanging this drawing sidewise as if the slabs were balconies. And this shows that, in fact, and it might even work, might look like a late constructivist or early Eisenman design. So, in fact, there is a tendency to in the direction of abstraction in this project, which is connected with the experience of Neutra acquired in discussing and in the contacts with people like Lundberg Holm and the early American functionalists. The Amerikabaut, as you can see it here, derives from Mendelssohn's idea of an architect using the camera of an architect working firsthand directly in the streets, but here we assist literally in the book to the construction of the Palmer House Hotel, a very important building, which is designed by the firm of Hollabird and Roach, for whom Neutra works. He presents himself in the book as being the draftsman, I think, number 326 of Hollabird and Roach, and discusses very closely, with great care, the daily practice of architecture in the office. This is, I think, a very important contribution of the About America. A point which is important in the book, as conceived by Neutra before its publication in 1927 in Germany, is that Neutra didn't feature any image of the facade of the completed Palmer House Hotel, and that the publisher, finally introducing a drawing of a facade, had to excuse himself and to say that this was done against the will of the author, but in order to give a visual image of the building against frustration. In fact, the point that Neutra wanted to make was, as Le Corbusier or the Russians would make it at the same time, that the most interesting aspect of European architecture was engineering. We see other aspects of Neutra's work, of Neutra's book. His celebration of the domestic equipment, his celebration of automatic windows, and all sorts of lightweight fixtures used in the buildings. In the book, Neutra quotes a very interesting prophecy by Henry Wright. Henry Wright, in a study quoted by Neutra, estimates that in 1970, that is more than almost 50 years later after the publication of the book, in the total cost of the building, only 15% will be left to the structure, and that the rest of the money will go to fixtures, will go to networks, will go to dry walls inside the building. So the About America is also important in the understanding that the problem of the structure is no longer the area in which innovation takes place, but that the buildings are becoming much more complex technological objects. Another aspect of the book is the discovery of, in this particular respect, of the Southern Californian building sites of Frank Lloyd Wright on the left, the concrete blocks houses of Wright. On the right, the Pueblo Ribera by Schindler, which had never been published in the West. We see Neutra, in a way, for the first time, giving the notion that in the horizons of southwestern California, in Los Angeles, but also in Palm Springs or near Santa Fe, we see the Taos Pueblo here compared to a North African oasis. He gives the notion that Americanism has to reframe its discourse and face the emergence of a new architecture in the Californian Southwest. Once again, the impact of the book is staggering in Germany. I will not bore you with details of its reception in America and Germany. And we see also here that the Russians, who are good readers of Neutra, they even did the only translation so far of the book. The only translation of the book, no English translation today. The only translation is Russian, published in 1929, Richard Neitra, with an introduction by a conservative architect called Alexei Shchusev, a rather cynical and masterful eclectic architect who, in order to pose as a modern, had to associate himself with one particular aspect of Americanism. Here we see pages of Neutra in Russian. It's rather ironic to see the Russian audience discovering the pueblos of Southern California in a book published by an Austrian in Germany at that time. Neutra will publish in 1930 a second book, a very important book, also called America. America, in a series edited in Vienna through his contacts with Vienna. The cover is a masterful collage by Lisitsky, which uses a photo of a skyscraper and also a photograph by Brett Weston, which you can see on the right. Beautiful photograph of smokestacks combined, mirrored and compared combined with skyscraper's image. But the important aspect of About America is not of America, the second book, sorry, is not in the contribution of Lisitsky, also someone who was dreaming at that time of American issues. We see here the obvious skyscrapers. Neutra in America returned to the skyscrapers. What is much more interesting is the very broad genealogy of American architecture, which is brought forward by Neutra. Neutra establishes a genealogy which goes back to Chicago architects like Le Baron Jenney in Chicago, to Burnham, to Sullivan Root, and from then on to Frank Lloyd Wright and Irving Gill. He had known Gill. He had been attracted to Gill because of his third American father. The second was Wright, the first was Lowes, the third one was Louis Sullivan, whom he had met, whom he had been to see in Chicago. It's interesting to see young Neutra in Chicago visiting Sullivan, who was completely forgotten, but was in correspondence, as you probably know, with Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos at that time wanted to publish Sullivan's writings and was in contact with him, and through Loos, Neutra tried to establish a contact, and in fact it is at Sullivan's funeral that he met Frank Lloyd Wright, with whom he was to work. So in America we see the development of American architecture, which leads to Neutra's Rush City Reformed, seen here on the right, another perspective of his ideal project, where streets here are visually compared to ducts on the top, to tubes. The city is really based on intense networks of circulation. But we see also the work that Neutra had done for Frank Lloyd Wright, an extremely important project drawn in 1924 by Neutra called the Sugarloaf, the Mount Sugarloaf Observatory, a project Wright designed for an observatory on which is shaped as a spiral, as a sort of Babel tower, a spiral on which cars climb to an observatory located on the top. This is a very important design, of course, in Wright's work, because when inverted, the spiral and inverted not only upside down or downside up, but also inverted outside in, it will, of course, become the spiral of the Guggenheim Museum. So Neutra, in fact, was in close contact with very interesting episodes in Wright's work. But it's more important, perhaps, to see what are the directions of Americanism as we can see them in the book of 1930, America. We see very down-to-earth illustrations. No one would have so far had dared to publish electricity wiring plans of American buildings. But this is once again the aspect of technical reporting. On the right, we see the work of the early constructivists I was mentioning, of Lomberg Holm, showing, giving an account of Neutra's affiliation with the new emerging American avant-garde. What we see here again, is the question of genealogy from the balloon frame to the skyscraper. This is the genealogy that Gideon would later borrow from Neutra in his lectures of 37 and in his book of 41, Space-Time Architecture. There is here a very close connection between, not to say intertextuality, between Neutra and Gideon. There is also a fairly different issue in the book, which I will mention at the end of this short discussion of America. Neutra presents, once again, in a very specific way, the technology of steel construction. You see here a very interesting shot showing how very heavy posts, very heavy columns are created by the combination of much smaller pieces of steel. But the most important aspect is perhaps the discussion that is made of two issues. One is the idea of dry assembly of buildings and the idea of rapid obsolescence of buildings. The other idea is the idea of the progressive dematerialization and prospective dematerialization of architecture. We see here on the left, Neutra will see the buildings, the high-rise buildings and the skyscrapers as essentially dismantleable, provisional buildings, buildings which, in a way, are modeled after the very fast run, the very fast flow of capital, of money in the American urban economy. Buildings which are from the outset designed to become obsolete, to be expendable. This is an extremely important issue to which, of course, architects will return in the 50s and 60s. On the right, Neutra celebrates open-air architecture, but also circus tents and lightweight buildings, and mentions the prospective development of architecture in the direction of an architecture of lightweight volumes, an architecture of tents, an architecture of transportable structures. This is, again, an effect of the contacts he has with architects like Lornberg-Holm and also with people like Buckminster Fuller. But now, let's see the other aspect, the other message which is now brought by Neutra. Neutra, the first Neutra was the technical reporter, the man, as you see, looking in details at American skyscrapers, looking at the small construction problems like Close was looking through the oak toilet seats. Neutra 2, the second Neutra, is bringing a different message. This time the message is architectural. It is an architectural message which comes in particular with the construction of the Lovell House in Hollywood, which is completed in 1928. We see here the publication of the Lovell House in a French magazine. Chantier was the technical supplement to L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui in 1934. The Lovell House had been built on the Hollywood Hills. You see on the left the first project, which has a definitely concrete-based architecture in its in the vision it gives from the sketch, and on the right montage, an early montage. The Lovell House was built for a couple of rather eccentric Californian liberals, Dr. Philip Lovell, who was a physician and who used to write the column Care of the Body in the Los Angeles Times. He was very close to the Californian socialists and was an apostle of natural life and free sexuality. His wife, Leah Press, was a teacher who was developing a pedagogic method based on theatrical play and had created a kindergarten in Los Angeles connected with the charities of Miss Aline Barnsdall, the client of Frank Lloyd Wright for the Hollyhock House. So here we see a very interesting encounter between radical clients and a radical architect like Neutra, an encounter which was very frequent in Europe in the 1920s, but quite original in the US. The Lovell House in Hollywood Hill is very important also because it is, in fact, the first major use of a lightweight steel frame for a house. Once again, it's inserted in Neutra's talent for publicity. The steel is provided free by Bethlehem Steel, providing that there will be enough propaganda. And we see here the house floating above water, above the water of a small pool of Leah Press's kindergarten, a vintage photo on the left and a recent photo on the right. So this house was sometimes published also as a school. And it is very important here because in a way it crystallizes a relationship to the outdoors, which is not the kind of relationship you could have in Vienna or Paris. The Lovell House is clearly connected. It's clearly a house in the park, a house in the landscape, almost a house in the mountain. The initial commission had been promised by Philip Lovell to Rudolf Schindler, but Schindler lost the commission because of the overrun, because of the excessive cost of the beach house he had designed for the same Philip Lovell in Newport Beach, and finally Neutra was able to make his point. Of course, another reason for the break between the two Viennese friends, the two Viennese Pals, Schindler and Neutra, who would meet again only on Schindler's deathbed in the hospital. We see here side scenes, and we see that the site is fairly well attended by the elegant, radical chic crowd of Los Angeles. The Lovell House has appeared, in a way, for most of the locals, for most of the Angelinos, but also for the European audience to which it was presented. Once again, we see two pictures of a publication made in France in 1934. The house, in a way, appeared as a sort of Southern Californian steel version of the Villa Savoie by Le Corbusier, as an example of the successful hybridization of notions of space that came from Europe, having integrated, of course, ideas coming from Frank Lloyd Wright and American lightweight technology. We see here the inside of the house, where a series of very interesting industrial ready-mades were used. Ford Model T car's headlights here inserted in the staircase, and also two brushing stands from Pullman railway cars used in the very beautiful bathroom. There was a sense of direct quotation from the industrial world in the house, which otherwise develops pretty freely according to an open plan. Sorry, to an open plan which is much closer to Frank Lloyd Wright than to Le Corbusier's Parisian villas of the late Purist period. We see here the view looking to the back of the house, to the entrance side, with a small courtyard here, and the view to the valley. The stairs are coming down here, and we see the development of the house with a completely transparent facade here, looking on the hills. So a very interesting manifesto in terms of technology as well as in terms of space. Frank Lloyd Wright will celebrate the building, receiving photos from Neutra, saying ideas ideas that one are what this powerful country needs to learn from Corbusier, Stevens, Aude, and Gropius. So it's interesting to see that he sees Neutra, that Wright sees Neutra at this moment like someone who is in fact introducing introducing ideas that seem to be coming from Europe and are accepted by the right. In a later moment, you probably know that Wright will disassociate himself from the 1932 MoMA exhibition on modern architecture organized by Hitchcock and Johnson because he refused to have his work shown alongside the work of people like Raymond Hood and Richard Neutra. But in an early moment, Wright saw the benefit he could draw from this architecture in his own fight. The clients will be rather unhappy. Lovell will say later, the plan was too Germanic. The children and housekeeper getting the worst, their rooms on the north were cold, and the master getting the best, all the sun. No possibility for nude sunbathing. No possibility for sleeping in the open. We screened in a porch to sleep on, but the beds were 12 inches apart. He called it health house, but Schindler gave us more along those lines. So in fact, the client was furious in terms of daily use, but the image of the house was very successful. Successful to the point of having, in fact, Neutra leading to a very successful promotion by Neutra that will bring to him European money to extend his experiments in domestic architecture. The Van der Loo research house, in fact, the house built for Neutra's family and himself, was built with a subsidy from a Dutch industrialist who wanted to, in a way, to use Neutra's architecture as a showcase, pretty much as Bethlehem Steel in 1928. In the meantime, Neutra started developing, it's inverted in fact, Neutra started developing other types of program which in fact looked at a European intervention on American ground. And this explains that in fact Neutra number 2, the architect of the Lovell House, was for a certain period of time perceived in Europe not as an American, but really as an European in exile, as someone who had voluntarily left Europe to work in a more productive environment where he would develop typically European themes. This is in particular the theme of many articles published, for instance, in Casabella in the 1930s by Pagano or other writers. It's also, to some extent, what Rainer Banham will say in his later writings in his Los Angeles, The Architecture for Ecologies. Banham writes that in the Lovell House, Neutra is using the Californian opportunity to make a European dream come true. And here, this is the dream of European low-cost housing, which is coming true, first of all, in concrete with the Jardinette apartment of the late 20s, and then with the apartments built close to UCLA in the mid-30s. We see row houses developing pretty much as the schemes designed by Aud and others in the Netherlands and Germany, but on a lightweight steel frame. This is probably one of the most beautiful of the early schemes designed by and built by Neutra close to UCLA in Los Angeles. The Landfair apartments, there are 3 such schemes. We see here the reading made in Italy of Neutra as a sort of, as Neutra is seen in Italy in the mid-30s when the rationalists are beginning to disassociate themselves from the fascist regime by the writers of Casabella who are anti-fascists, in particular Anna Maria Mazzucchelli, who will be the wife of Carlo Giulio Argan, writes that in fact the destiny of Neutra, it's a veiled allusion to the necessary exile from a reactionary culture such as Italy, seen from the views of the left, Mazzucchelli sees in Neutra's exile a sort of premonition of what would happen to the European avant-garde. We see here other parts of further issues of Casabella proposing, suggesting a discorso su Neutra. Neutra is really taken seriously as an exponent of this projection of European architecture to the US. In fact, Neutra has some success in Europe as well. We see here the small house that he built in 1932 in Vienna, very small house in the Werkbundsiedlung in Vienna. And the destiny changes, of course, in the second part of the 1930s. What we see on the right is the house he built in 1937, 38 in the San Fernando Valley for Josef von Sternberg, the movie maker, and of course his girlfriend Marlene Dietrich, with a garden by Isamu Noguchi. The exiles come to Los Angeles. This will be the case of the movie makers, but also of playwrights like Brecht and many other intellectuals. And in this new milieu, Neutra's architecture will take a different meaning. After World War II, I come to a conclusion. After World War II, the role of Neutra changes. Neutra, again, Neutra number 3 emerges. No longer the reporter, no longer the European in a rather sad but productive exile. Neutra is now acknowledged as the ultimate American architecture, as carrying the discourse of architectural modernization with American technology and with reference no longer to dense cities like Chicago or New York, which had been the very nucleus of early Americanism. America used to be represented in a rather metonymic association before by New York or Chicago. After 45, America is represented by Americanism, and America are represented by Los Angeles, Southern California, and a car-based way of life. And this time Neutra is the architect who replaces the former heroes of Americanism. In America even, we see that he gets, and this will further irritate Frank Lloyd Wright, he's the first architect ever to get a cover story of Time magazine, before Frank Lloyd Wright and Philip Johnston probably, if we can call Johnston, if we can mention the name after the first two. Here we see also the powerful images that will come to Europe. The Kaufmann House in Palm Springs, as photographed by Julius Schulman, will become an archetypal image of the new way of life, of a new intimate fusion of indoors and outdoors in a humanized desert such as Palm Springs. So Neutra's work will take a new meaning and will be supported by scores of groups. Neutra will be instrumentalized and used in the European debate pretty much as other American discourses had been used. Here we see Neutra's real contribution to the making of American wartime and post-war material infrastructure. He takes part, he builds the Channel Heights settlement for wartime factory workers in Los Angeles on the left. On the right, a plan for a NATO base in Seville, Spain, as Americans would say, and not Seville, Texas. So he will be a very active promoter of the Americanization of the world, of the transformation of parts of the world according to, in this case, an almost colonial fact, according to American standards. At the same time, he will fail his major project. His major project was a project for social housing in the Chavez Ravine in Los Angeles, a project scrapped because the Los Angeles municipality decided that social housing was communist, and they dropped the project. At that time, of course, Neutra, this would be another topic, would be a topic for a cycle of lecture. Neutra was in trouble because his brother-in-law, who had been very important in carrying his message in scores of articles in the 20s and 30s in Europe. His name was Roger Ginsburger, an Alsatian Jew. Ginsburger, who had published a book on France, a companion to the book on America published by Neutra in 1930. Ginsburger, in the meantime, had vanished and resurfaced as a prominent leader of the Communist Party in Paris. So he was very embarrassed to be associated with, in the times of McCarthyism, with the left, and therefore worked in a very, very tough way to construct his image as the image of an all-American architect subscribing to all-American values. Sorry, we see here the project that failed. We see here the projects that started, the new projects with the insertion of wood and brick during the war because of problems with steel, but an increasing integration of the natural surroundings. These new projects will become very important for the post-war generation. In post-war Americanism, values such as transportability, lightness of assembly will become very important. We see here the poster of an exhibition, that important exhibition organized by Paul Nelson in Paris in '46. Here the companion issue of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui on the notion of quick assembly of houses. In this framework, the image of Neutra becomes very important. And it is interesting to see that the first post-war issue of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui in Paris devoted to an architect, the first monograph. There had been only two monographs before in the 30s, one on Perret, one on Le Corbusier. Number 3 is on Neutra. And Neutra is shown, is presented to the French audience as an architecte d'aujourd'hui, as the very image of the post-war architect, the one that finally realizes, implements the dream of lightweight factory prepared houses, a dream that the French will try to realize without any success with the victory of the concrete lobby after the war. We see here in particular a real hymn to Neutra written by Marcel Lotz, French functionalist, companion of Prouvé and others, and who really seems to discover finally a sort of divine glass and aluminium architecture meeting Neutra. At the same time, we see, well, probably I'll skip these two, we see the new houses of Neutra triggering the interest of various groups inside Europe. In Italy, on the left, the houses of Neutra will be supported by, of course, by Bruno Zevi. Bruno Zevi, who had been the propagandist of the organic architecture of Wright, will see in Neutra a direct extension of the Wrightian discourse, and we'll see in Neutra's work a very good case for, in short, for the modernization of the argument of organic architecture. On the right, we see the Tremaine house, which had apparently a very strong impact on the young architects in this country. If we are to believe what John Winter wrote at the time of Neutra's death in 1970, I quote Winter from the Arabic Journal. I think it's an interesting short piece. I well remember the impact on us of the architectural reviews publishing the Tremaine House in '50. At that time, sociology and arts schools were de rigueur for AA students. And the very affluence of the Tremaine House, on the right, made it seem a rather sinful Playboy's thing, but it could not be lightly brushed aside because its imagery was so compelling and its siting so beautiful, and in any case, had not the open web joists of our beloved Hertz schools been developed from those of Neutra's Lovell House and the single-story planning from Neutra's school at Bell, a school built by Neutra in Los Angeles. So we see, in fact, on the British scene, Neutra's architecture taking a new meaning, and this is true for many other European cultures at that time. I remember, but not probably no one was in this country at that time, but I remind you that the British reception of America, that the British Amerikanism of the 50s is in a way framed by two very different discourses. The one on the left, for instance, is the 1950 issue of the Architectural Review called Man-Made America, and which is in fact an almost complete rejection of the mess that is man-made America. It's a taste-based rejection of American vulgarity, which will lead to directly to the reaction of people like Venturi in the 60s. If Venturi celebrates what he calls the ugly and the beautiful, it is in direct answer to this analysis of the Architectural Review carried in America by people like Peter Blake. We see here the page where Los Angeles, where Neutra had worked, is seen by the team of the Architectural Review as the city unbeautiful per excellence. On the right, 7 years later, the independent group has worked hard to promote American popular culture in a very ironic and very autonomous and very playful way, and this leads to a new issue of the Architectural Review called Machine Made America, where John McHale concocts a cover with a combination of frozen stacks, gears, transistors, well, not yet transistors, but pistons and mechanical pieces. So between these two issues, the view of America changes, and of course the view of California also starts to change. This is not to say that Neutra becomes, that Neutra's late work, which is rather repetitive, is celebrated in this country. There is widespread diffidence. I quote here a report on California by Jim Ackerman, also in the Architectural Review in 1956, discovering Los Angeles at that time. The work of the better architects, he says, seems to be weakened by the need to be fashionable or photogenic, and it shows a strong tendency to imitation. I should say that this is true of Neutra too, though is legitimized by the fact that he imitates himself as of the 30s. So in fact, the best observers see the complete stasis in the work of Neutra during that time. I will conclude by showing two more images connected with the late British Americanism. Of course, the fascination of this lightweight and transportable America, which had been planned, imagined, fantasized by Neutra in 1930 in America, could be seen when in the work of Archigram. Archigram attracted fatally to the US, in particular with the late project, one of the later projects called Instant City, here funded by the Grand Foundation and here shown in one of its typical configurations at a freeway interchange in Los Angeles. And on the right, of course, the Lovell House in Banham's book of 1971, Los Angeles, which is in a way which indicates how much Banham, who knew Mendelssohn's book very well, who had discussed the work of Neutra on several opportunities, which shows how much, in fact, for how long Banham had been attracted by the Los Angeles scene. If I can conclude, I would make I would stress a couple of points on Neutra's architecture and his contribution to the Americanist discourse. So the first point is quite clear. Neutra's work in its traveling back and forth between a European identity and an American identity is an expression of the power, of the shaping power of Americanism in 20th century architecture. In fact, Neutra's work is at the edge between, at the rather uncomfortable edge between Americanism, between the realm of ideas, the realm of images, and the realm of reality, which is connected with Americanization post-World War II. Neutra also, and this is a point I made already with About America, symbolizes the displacement, the drifting of Americanism to the West, to California. And in this aspect, he plays a very important role in inside the cultural pattern of Americanism. The third aspect is rather important. Although Neutra is involved in some quasi-social housing programs, the architecture, the modern architecture it brings to Europe is an architecture which is no longer associated, identified with social issues. It is an architecture which is autonomous, which floats somewhere between social reform on one hand and the identification to the big money. Neutra's architecture is not like the architecture of Mies van der Rohe, connected with corporate programs or institutional programs, with some exceptions. It's not connected with the social issues. It is, in a way, rather close to the architecture which is built by many professionals also in Europe. The fourth dimension I have not mentioned, but it is rather important also, and has to do with the subjectivity of Neutra. His rather self-conscious use of publicity, but at the same time, his insistence on psychological issues on architecture, an insistence which is partly based on his very intimate knowledge of psychoanalysis, of psychoanalytical issues, and also of psychoanalysts. His friend at school in Vienna was Ernst Freud, the son of Sigmund Freud, and he had absorbed at a pretty early age the discourse, some fragments of the discourse of psychoanalysis. Sylvia Levin, the American architectural historian, had made a point about his later absorption of the discourse of Wilhelm Reich, and in particular of Reich's obsession with the organic energy. I wouldn't go that far. I think it might be a convincing point to some extent. I wouldn't go that far, but let's just say that in the discussion of the intimate relationship with the clients, of the intimate ability of the architect to identify his patient/client's problems, Neutra was a rather interesting pioneer. And finally, I would insist on one interesting contradiction of Neutra's work in the values of Neutra's work. Neutra's work remains a very ambiguous work in the 30s and until the 50s. It is based on one hand on mechanical reproduction, on the use of lightweight elements, and this is what will trigger the interest of many European architects to these days. At the same time, it is an architecture which remains completely unique in its relationship to the site, which is extremely site-specific. Neutra typically would give, and this is part of this psychological manipulation, probably would give to every client after the completion of the building a perspective of the building with vegetation on the foreground. Very beautiful drawings where his graphic skills as developed in Vienna before 14 would survive. So it would give this idea of houses which were built of completely standard elements, but which could produce highly individualized configurations of houses. In a way, the dream of the customized factory house for the customized client. A completely American dream, of course, by an architect who would have floated, as you've probably understood, for maybe 4 decades between the two sides of the ocean. Thank you. Yes, yes,
Yeah?
yes, it was very long.
Maybe there are some questions. While you're thinking, just probably a small point, but it was interesting when you were showing the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah.
So I don't remember where it was. I thought I read that towards the end of his life, when Neutra actually went back to Vienna and lived there for quite some time, but he became quite, in a sense, disappointed with some of his experiences in the state, and somehow returned to his. Is that?
No, I would. No, I don't. I don't think so. I don't think so. Neutra had lots of problems in his later life. He had a very bad heart attack, and he developed a very interesting practice. He had converted his bedroom into an architectural drafting office, reduced his family to slavery, and would his wife in particular, and he worked really in a static way. Made lots of travel, tried to secure lots of commission, and died, if I remember well, he died in Germany while going there to discuss a commission. He tried to get commissions, but he developed mostly his Californian practice with his son, destructing in the same movement his son Dan, who yes. Yes, but their own house burned and was redone. So the house you see now is not the original VDM house, which was much more interesting, much less kitschy. Neutra would go to Europe typically to make lectures with one condition: his wife would play the cello before. So you had two performances, in fact, for the price of one. Oh yes, of course. Yes, yes. I think there is little of Corbusier. There is almost there is not much round planning. A little bit probably in the most of the structures built by Neutra, with some exceptions, are one-story homes. Very small vertical extensions. In some of the collective housing projects, there is a certain, what we could call a certain round planning, and it is particularly obvious to see that Neutra works very much with axonometrics and develops his thinking with axonometrics, in very mechanical axonometrics in an interesting way. What is probably more interesting, more revealing of Neutra's work is the later plans, which are butterfly-like plans that expand from central cores to the outside. In a way, they belong to some extent also to the family of plans like Mrs. Brick Country House. And this allows, of course, for the creation of almost autonomous small milieus, I would say half patios connecting the house with specific outdoors environments. So in fact there is a certain quality of planning, but probably, as you've noticed, I've tried to stick probably exceedingly to images and to the circulation of Neutra's work in images, but it is true that the plans are discussed, for instance, by Gideon in his introduction to the book published in 50 on the complete work of Neutra by Gersberger, who had also done the complete work of Korb before. So I think there is clearly a Neutra-esque culture of plan design, which I've not paid homage to.
What about this aspect of, is there any link with this issue of theosophy, the Lovell house, the people who were doing the chocolate factory
Yes.
in Rotterdam?
Yes, the Van Nelle, yes.
Van Nelle, yes. They came to visit the house, or there's some... just in relation to this idea of mass production versus the question of the kind of
they
different
came, but
aspects
I don't think that the Neutra were pretty much into that. They were into music and psychoanalysis and not into mysticism. So I don't think that this aspect of the Dutch experience permitted them. Another, it has to be said that Neutra was Jewish, and that this aspect probably also played an important role in his establishment in the Los Angeles society. Schindler was also Jewish, so in a way they were in competition for a certain period of time at least, in competition in the same group, in the same milieu of rather progressive Jews. And, but Neutra in his basic culture was much more, I think, into a sort of pragmatic secularist than in really embedded in philosophical or mystical ideas.
It was in relation, it's simultaneous that you talk about the housing
Yes.
production, but his approach to the city.
Yes. Was it related to?
There is any very connection with this intimacy that the relation that is really is
Yes.
How to see this by the city or is something
I don't think he has any interest for the city. Neutra,
because some of the drawings
yes, in the late 20s, Neutra has a certain interest with the city, and I think it's pure conformism. It is really a way of subscribing to a type of avant-garde architect which has been defined by Le Corbusier or Hilbersheimer, someone who is capable of having a grand design for the contemporary metropolis. So he has a grand design, and he will go on over the years polishing his Rush City Reformed, having people design more in his office, add new projects to the scheme. But I don't. It will be a rather a scheme of fantasy and not really anything addressing the real city. So I think his attitude was really, I think, customizing architecture to a great deal, and in particular through the relationship with the client's wives, relationship which was much less, in fact, committing than the one of Schindler, but which was nonetheless was extremely important in his dealing and in his practice of negotiating the project.